Let's talk about one of the weirdest and most misunderstood conflicts in American history, the War of 1812. Seriously, on the surface, this war is a real head-scratcher. It started for reasons that basically vanished the moment it began. Its most famous battle was fought after the peace treaty was already signed, and it ended with, well, with everyone just agreeing to pretend it never happened.
So, who actually won this thing? The answer is way more complicated and honestly way more interesting than you might think. Let's get into it. Okay, first up, let's tackle the craziest part of this whole story. You've heard of the Battle of New Orleans, right? Andrew Jackson's huge victory, the thing that made him a national hero. The only problem? It happened in January of 1815. That was 2 full weeks after diplomats in Europe had signed the peace treaty. The news just hadn't made it across the Atlantic yet. So thousands of soldiers fought and died in a major battle for a war that was already over. It's just mind-boggling.
And what about that peace treaty? It was built on this idea called status quo ante bellum. It's a fancy Latin phrase that basically means, let's just put everything back the way it was before the war started. It was a giant reset button. No land changed hands, none of the big issues that supposedly started the war were even mentioned. So what on earth was the point?
To figure that out, we have to rewind and see how this whole thing got started. Because even with all its confusion, this war of contradictions ended up shaping the future of North America in ways nobody could have seen coming. You're not going to believe the miscommunication that kicked this all off. The U.S. declared war on June 18, 1812, mostly because of these British trade rules that were hurting the American economy. But just 5 days later, over in London, the British government got rid of those rules. They were trying to fix the relationship. But this was before Twitter or even the telegraph. The news took weeks to cross the ocean. By the time the Americans found out, the war was already in full swing. For the British, this was all just a minor headache anyway. Their real fight was against Napoleon in Europe. So if the main reason for the war disappeared almost instantly, what was really going on? Well, the truth is, it was a perfect storm of issues that had been brewing for a long, long time. It was a whole cocktail of problems. Yeah, the trade stuff was big, but then you had this really personal, emotional issue of impressment. You also had Britain backing indigenous nations who were pushing back against American expansion. And beneath it all was this growing feeling in America that their national honor was being insulted. Oh, and of course, some folks definitely had their eyes on maybe, just maybe, annexing Canada while they were at it. It wasn't just one thing. It was everything all at once. We really need to talk about impressment for a second because this was the issue that got people really fired up. The British Royal Navy was desperate for sailors to fight Napoleon, so they claimed they had the right to board American ships and grab any sailor they thought was a British deserter. The problem was they were often wrong, and they ended up kidnapping actual American citizens, forcing them to serve on British warships. For Americans, this was an absolute outrage. So, war is on, and honestly, neither side was really ready. What followed was this incredibly messy, chaotic war full of shocking wins and really embarrassing losses for everyone involved. I mean, the whole thing was a roller coaster. In 1812, the American invasion of Canada is a complete disaster. Detroit just surrenders. Then, the next year, the U.S. Navy pulls off a huge win on Lake Erie. But then in 1814, the British literally march into Washington and burn the White House down. A total humiliation. But just a month later, the Americans stopped the British cold in Baltimore. It was just this constant tug of war where neither side could get the upper hand. And you can just imagine the frustration of the American leaders. The president himself, James Madison, saw with his own eyes the American militia just turn and run from professional British soldiers outside of Washington. That quote from him says it all. The U.S. was relying on these part-time state militias, and a lot of the time it was like sending amateurs to fight against seasoned pros. But here's the twist. While the Army was a bit of a mess out on the ocean, it was a totally different ballgame. The small but highly professional U.S. Navy scored one shocking victory after another in these one-on-one ship duels. Ships like the USS Constitution, old Ironsides, were actually built bigger and tougher than their British rivals. Beating the legendary Royal Navy at its own game was a massive morale boost for the Americans, even if it didn't really change the war's outcome. So after a few years of this slugfest, everybody was just tired. Britain was done with the expense, especially after finally beating Napoleon, and the U.S. economy was in shambles. So they decided to talk peace, which brings us back to that bizarre treaty that seemed to do, well, nothing. So the guiding principle here was that phrase again, status quo ante bellum. Since the diplomats couldn't agree on anything major, they took the easy way out. They just hit the ultimate undo button and decided to go back to the way things were before anyone had fired a shot. Seriously, think about this. All the territory that had been captured was handed back. The border with Canada stayed exactly the same. An impressment, that really emotional issue that was a huge reason for the war, not a single word about it in the treaty. On paper, it looked like thousands of people had died for absolutely nothing. This brings us right back to our big question. If the official document was a total wash, a big nothing burger, then who were the real winners and losers here? To find that answer, we can't look at the treaty. We have to look at what came after. Okay, our final section, winners, losers, and legacies. This is where we find the real answers. Because the war's true impact wasn't on any map. It was on the identities and the futures of the people living in North America. Let's break down the unofficial scorecard. For the United States, you've got to call it a win. It was like a second war of independence. It kicked off this huge wave of national pride and confidence. For Great Britain, kind of a shrug, a draw. Their main goal was defending Canada, and they did that. For Canada, though, this was a massive win. Fighting off the Americans helped create a unique Canadian identity, separate from the US. But then, you get to the Indigenous nations who had allied with Britain. And for them, it was an absolute catastrophe, a total loss. And if you want to understand just how devastating that loss was, look at this number. 22 million acres. That's the amount of land the Creek Nation was forced to give up after being defeated by Andrew Jackson. And that includes the Creeks who had fought with the Americans. Their British allies were gone, and the path was cleared for massive American expansion into their lands. So, in a strange way, this weird, seemingly pointless war completely changed the trajectory of North America. First, it removed the two biggest obstacles to American westward expansion, the British and their Indigenous allies. Second, it pretty much guaranteed that Canada would develop as its own separate country. And finally, and this is the really ironic part, after fighting this bitter war, the US and Britain actually started to build a peaceful relationship, which eventually led to the world's longest undefended border. So in the end, the big lesson from the War of 1812 is that a conflict's real meaning often isn't about who won the battles or what the treaty says. It's about the long, slow, and often unexpected consequences. It really makes you think, doesn't it? What if a war that looks like a tie on paper could actually end up changing everything?